good evening, or maybe good morning, depending on where in the world you've found yourself listening from tonight. I'd genuinely like to know, so if you feel like it, you can leave your city and the current time down in the comments. I always imagine these stories drifting through dark bedrooms, quiet apartments, long highways, tiny headphones under blankets, thousands of people awake at strange hours for reasons they rarely explain. And if you happen to enjoy these long journeys into uncomfortable corners of history and humanity, you can subscribe as well. No pressure. Ancient humans survived for hundreds of thousands of years without subscriptions, so statistically speaking, you'll probably be all right. Tonight, though, we are stepping into something deeply strange, because there may have been a moment, not a dramatic lightning bolt moment, but a slow, invisible one, when human beings became trapped inside their own minds for the very first time. A long time ago, before cities, before gods, before kings, before writing, before names carved into stone, there were humans whose brains looked almost identical to ours. But inside, something was missing. Or perhaps something had not yet fully awakened. And that possibility is unsettling in a way that is difficult to describe. Because what does a human feel like before language fully exists? Not an animal, not modern. Something in between. Something unfinished. And the strange thing is, they may not have known it themselves. There is a tendency in modern life to imagine the ancient world as distant and primitive, populated by people grunting around campfires with uncomplicated minds. But the more archaeologists uncover, the less comfortable that idea becomes. These people buried their dead carefully. They cared for injured tribe members for years. They crossed dangerous terrain together. They survived winters so brutal that most modern people would mentally collapse within a week. These were not simple creatures, and that makes the mystery worse. Because if they already loved, feared, mourned, remembered, then what exactly changed when language finally bloomed into full complexity? What rewired? What broke open inside the skull? Somewhere in the darkness of prehistory, a human being may have looked into another person's eyes and, for the first time, successfully transferred a fully imagined thought into another mind. Not just danger, not just hunger, not just run, something larger, something invisible. Perhaps a memory, perhaps a warning about tomorrow, perhaps a lie. And after that moment, humanity was never quiet again. It is difficult for us to imagine existence without internal narration, because modern humans are drowning in it constantly. Most people cannot stop talking inside their own heads for even 10 seconds. There is always some voice discussing the future, replaying humiliation, imagining conversations that never happen, remembering awkward things from 11 years ago while trying to shower peacefully. The ancient world may have been mentally quieter, or perhaps more frightening. There is a difference. Imagine sitting in darkness without words for your fear. Not because you are unintelligent, but because your thoughts exist more as sensations than sentences. The grass outside moves. Your heart accelerates. You hear breathing. You do not think. There may be a predator nearby. Instead, your body becomes the thought. Your scalp tightens. Your muscles freeze. Your ears strain against the dark. Fear exists as weather inside the nervous system. And prehistoric humans lived inside that weather constantly. The ancient night was not silent the way modern people sometimes imagine. Silence itself was rare and suspicious. There were always sounds leaking from the darkness. Insects screaming in endless rhythm. Wind dragging across dry grass. Cracking branches somewhere beyond the firelight. distant animal calls, coughing tribe members, babies waking unexpectedly, someone turning in sleep, wet breathing from exhausted lungs. Humans evolved surrounded by uncertain noises, which may explain why modern humans still become deeply uncomfortable in complete silence. A totally silent room feels unnatural because the human nervous system was designed in a world that never stopped whispering possible danger. And the darkness itself was different. Modern darkness is usually artificial, soft, contained. Even lonely people still live surrounded by distant electrical civilization. Refrigerators hum, cars move outside. Tiny LEDs glow faintly in bedrooms, like mechanical insects. Ancient darkness swallowed the world completely. Firelight ended a few feet away. After that came uncertainty. And uncertainty, interestingly enough, may have helped invent language, because uncertainty creates desperate communication. A strange thing about humans is that we do not simply react to danger. We rehearse it. We revisit it. We imagine it returning tomorrow. A wolf attack is not only frightening while it happens, it becomes frightening later around the fire. Then again during migration. Then again years afterward when telling younger tribe members where not to sleep. Language allowed danger to survive longer than the danger itself. And once that happened, fear became permanent. You can almost imagine early humans trapped in the uncomfortable middle stage of this transformation. Intelligent enough to remember suffering, but not yet fully capable of organizing memory into stable narrative. A terrible combination, because memory, without explanation, becomes haunting. There may have been humans who remembered floods, starvation, disappearances in the forest, strange illnesses, but could not fully describe causation. They carried emotional residue without structured storytelling. Even today, people often experience this after trauma. The body remembers before language catches up. Ancient humans may have lived there permanently for thousands of generations. And slowly, almost invisibly, something changed. Perhaps it began with rhythm. Many scientists suspect language did not appear suddenly as vocabulary and grammar. It may have emerged gradually through emotional sounds, gestures, repeated social patterns, and shared vocal rhythms. Humans are extremely sensitive to rhythm, even now. We calm babies through rhythmic sound. We chant together in crowds. Soldiers march in rhythm. Religious ceremonies rely on synchronized speech. Rhythm organizes human attention, which means language may have begun less like philosophy and more like music, a soft repetition around firelight, warnings repeated enough times to become stable, sounds attached to recurring experiences, and at first, those sounds were probably clumsy. We often imagine the first words as noble milestones of civilization. In reality, early speech may have been deeply awkward, repetitive, confusing, half-gestural, filled with misunderstandings. Entire hunting parties may have argued because somebody invented a sound for a river crossing, and another tribe member interpreted it as large animal nearby. And, honestly, modern humans are not dramatically better. People destroy marriages every day over text messages, missing punctuation tone. Human communication remains astonishingly fragile considering civilization depends entirely on it. But prehistoric fragility carried sharper consequences. If someone misunderstood where winter food was stored, people died. If migration timing was explained poorly, children froze. If poisonous plants were confused with medicinal ones, entire groups became violently ill together. And this is where language stopped being a curiosity and became survival technology. Knowledge suddenly became portable. Before language, information largely died with the body carrying it. After language, experience could survive beyond the individual. That changed evolution itself. A single, clever human could now transfer survival advantage into younger brains without genetics needing to slowly evolve it over thousands of years, which is almost terrifying when you think about it. Because language allowed humans to evolve culturally faster than biology could stabilize psychologically, our minds may still be struggling to catch up. Modern humans possess Stone Age nervous systems overloaded by symbolic complexity their ancestors never anticipated. The brain evolved to track maybe 100 social relationships and seasonal dangers. Instead, it now processes global catastrophe headlines while sitting alone eating cereal under artificial light at midnight. And still, underneath all that, ancient instincts remain intact, especially around other humans. One of the strangest theories about language is that it may not have evolved primarily for hunting, or survival against nature, or even tool-making, but for gossip, which sounds ridiculous until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. As human groups grew larger, social complexity exploded. In tiny groups, everyone can personally observe everyone else. But once tribes become bigger, direct observation fails. Now you need reputation. You need social memory. You need information about people not currently present. Who stole food? Who lies? Who abandons injured members? Who can be trusted during migration? Who becomes violent unpredictably? Language solved this, which means civilization may have emerged, partly because humans became obsessed with discussing each other behind their backs. A truly majestic origin story, not wisdom descending from heaven, just prehistoric social anxiety evolving into syntax. And honestly, little has changed. Modern humans still dedicate extraordinary amounts of mental energy toward reputation management. Entire industries exist because humans desperately fear social exclusion. Clothing, cosmetics, public relations, online branding, corporate language training, political speech writing. We are still terrified tribal mammals trying to survive social judgment. Except now we do it through Wi-Fi. The ancient tribe, though, had harsher penalties. If enough people distrusted you, you might simply not survive winter, which transformed language into something dangerous. Words could now wound socially before physical violence even occurred. A rumor could isolate someone from food access. An accusation could destroy mating opportunities. A whispered story could permanently stain identity. Language created invisible weapons. And perhaps even more importantly, invisible futures. Animals largely live inside immediacy. Humans escaped that prison through symbolic thought. Once language became sophisticated enough, humans could discuss things not physically present. Tomorrow, next winter, possible betrayal, migration routes, dead ancestors, imagined gods. This was revolutionary beyond comprehension, but it also introduced chronic anxiety into human existence. Because once the brain learns to simulate the future, it never entirely stops. That may have been the true rewiring, not speech itself, but recursive imagination. The ability to mentally experience events before they happen, which sounds useful until you realize it also means humans became capable of suffering over imaginary disasters continuously. A prehistoric human lying awake near fading firelight might begin replaying previous hunts mentally, then imagining future hunts, then imagining failure, then imagining starvation. The body reacts to imagined danger surprisingly similarly to real danger, meaning language may have accidentally created permanent psychological stress. A remarkable achievement for a species just trying not to get eaten. And yet, despite all this discomfort, language offered extraordinary advantages, especially after fire changed human time itself. Before reliable fire use, darkness restricted activity severely. Night belonged mostly to predators and uncertainty. Humans became vulnerable, cautious, compressed into survival stillness. But fire extended the social day, and something fascinating happens when humans sit around firelight. Even modern people experience it. Conversation slows, faces become hypnotic, thoughts drift, stories lengthen unnecessarily. Nobody seems entirely eager to leave. Firelight creates a psychological chamber, unlike electric light. It flickers unpredictably, forcing the brain into soft attention. Shadows move constantly at the edge of vision. Human faces glow warmly against surrounding darkness. Around these fires, ancient humans likely began stretching thought outward through storytelling, and stories were not entertainment at first. They were memory storage. A story about a river spirit might actually preserve flood patterns. A tale about monsters in the hills might encode predator territory. Myths often hide practical survival information beneath emotional imagery. And because memory is fragile, repetition became sacred. That is why oral traditions repeat constantly. Modern audiences sometimes find repetition unnecessary because writing preserves information externally. But prehistoric humans stored civilization inside brains. Repetition prevented cultural extinction. A forgotten warning could kill descendants centuries later. So humans repeated, and repeated, and repeated, until rhythm itself became memory technology. Which may explain why even now people remember songs more easily than spoken instructions. The ancient brain learned through cadence. And somewhere, during all these long nights of repetition and ritual, another unsettling transformation occurred. Humans began speaking to the dead, not literally at first, but psychologically. Once names existed, people could remain socially present after death. This changed grief forever. Before symbolic permanence, death may have faded faster from collective memory. But once humans could preserve identity through language, the dead lingered inside conversations. A grandfather's warning survives. A mother's phrase repeats. A lost hunter becomes story. Language created ghosts long before religion formalized them. And perhaps that is why humans remain uniquely haunted creatures. We carry thousands of invisible people inside our minds through language alone. Their voices survive without bodies. Their ideas survive without breath, which is beautiful and slightly terrifying. And the more language evolved, the stranger humans became. There is a peculiar loneliness hidden inside the human mind. Modern people rarely notice it because they are born directly into language. Words arrive so early that most cannot remember existence before them. A child hears voices long before understanding them, and then gradually the strange machinery begins assembling itself inside the skull. Sounds attach to objects, objects attach to meaning, meaning attaches to memory, memory attaches to identity, and then one day, without ceremony, a human being begins speaking silently to themselves forever, which is an extraordinary thing when you slow down enough to notice it. Right now, at this exact moment, millions of people are alone with invisible conversations happening inside their heads. They rehearse arguments in showers. They explain imaginary scenarios while driving. They relive embarrassing moments from years ago while trying to fall asleep. Some even narrate tiny actions internally, as though a small, exhausted storyteller has rented permanent space inside the brain. Ancient humans may not always have experienced consciousness this way, or at least, not fully. That possibility disturbs neuroscientists more than they usually admit openly. Because if internal narration evolved gradually, then somewhere in prehistory there may have existed humans with minds quieter than ours. Not peaceful, just quieter, and perhaps less trapped. It is possible that thoughts once moved through the body more directly, without being endlessly translated into internal language. Hunger arrived as hunger. Fear arrived as fear. Grief arrived as grief. Not paragraphs. Modern humans often experience emotions twice. First physically, then linguistically. The body feels something, and immediately the mind begins describing it, interpreting it, dramatizing it, arguing with it, predicting consequences, comparing it to old memories. The ancient brain may have lingered closer to raw sensation. And if that is true, then language did not merely help humans communicate with others. It permanently altered the relationship humans had with themselves. A dangerous development, in retrospect, because once the mind learns to speak internally, it becomes very difficult to make it stop. Even now, silence terrifies many people more than they realize. Not physical silence, mental silence. People fill empty moments compulsively. Music during walking, podcasts during cooking, television during sleep, constant scrolling during boredom, tiny digital noises layered endlessly over consciousness, like insulation against something ancient and uncomfortable. Perhaps against the realization that the human mind became too good at generating thought. There is an almost tragic irony hidden inside evolution here. Language helped humans survive externally while destabilizing them internally. A marvelous trade agreement. You survive winter, but now you also develop existential dread. Congratulations! And early humans may have experienced the first stages of this transformation in deeply unsettling ways. Imagine the first generation, truly capable of rich, symbolic thought. Their parents perhaps communicated adequately through gesture, emotional sound, repeated patterns, and simple vocabulary. But now, something new begins emerging. More abstraction, more temporal thinking, more invisible mental simulation. Suddenly, a human can describe something that has never happened. That changes reality itself. Now imagination becomes transferable. A hunter can invent danger that does not exist. A tribe member can describe a future catastrophe before any evidence appears. A person can manipulate others using purely symbolic threats. And this may have been the birth of anxiety-driven civilization. Because language did not only create cooperation, it created anticipation. And anticipation is psychologically expensive. An animal fears the storm while it happens. A human fears the storm 3 days beforehand, then again afterward, then every rainy season for the next 20 years. Language allows suffering to stretch across time, which means prehistoric humans were not simply evolving communication, they were evolving extended psychological vulnerability. There is evidence even today that the human nervous system struggles to distinguish between vividly imagined danger and immediate physical danger. Heart rate changes, stress hormones rise, muscles tighten, sleep becomes shallow. The body obeys symbolic fear surprisingly easily, which may explain why ancient myths became so powerful so quickly. Once humans could speak fluently about invisible things, entire tribes became emotionally organized around imagined realities. Spirits, curses, ancestors, punishment after death, protective beings in forests, watching eyes in darkness. And to modern people, this sometimes sounds foolish, until they notice they themselves still live psychologically inside invisible symbolic systems. Money is symbolic. Nationality is symbolic. Status is symbolic. Most modern stress originates from things that cannot physically bite you. Ancient humans merely began the process. And the process escalated rapidly, because language also created another dangerous phenomenon: the lie, a truly revolutionary invention. Before sophisticated language, deception exists mostly through action. Hiding food, stealing quietly, physical concealment. But once symbolic communication becomes advanced enough, humans gain the ability to manipulate reality socially without changing reality physically. A person can now claim loyalty while planning betrayal. A person can invent stories. A person can deny events others witnessed. Civilization itself partially depends on this strange power, which means the first truly fluent humans may also have become the first truly dangerous humans. Not physically, psychologically. Imagine encountering a human capable of persuasive speech before your own brain fully developed defensive skepticism. That individual could alter group decisions through narrative alone. This is not far removed from modern life. Unfortunately, entire populations still reorganize behavior based on emotionally persuasive storytelling. Only now the storytellers wear suits and appear on television. Ancient humans probably experienced smaller versions of the same phenomenon around fires at night. Certain individuals would naturally become influential, not because they were strongest, but because they controlled attention. Language shifted dominance away from pure physical power. That changed human hierarchy permanently. And once hierarchy becomes symbolic, humans become obsessed with reputation. Modern humans often underestimate how biologically terrifying social exclusion feels. But prehistoric life depended completely on group survival. Isolation frequently meant death. No fire sharing, no cooperative hunting, no protection during sleep. So, the human nervous system evolved to experience social rejection almost like physical injury, and language intensified this dramatically. Because now criticism could spread, stories could spread, embarrassment could spread. A single humiliating event could follow someone socially for years. The first gossipers probably had no idea they were helping construct civilization. Or psychological torture. Possibly both. There is something strangely exhausting about the human need to discuss absent people. Yet this behavior appears ancient beyond comprehension. Even modern conversations drift toward social analysis constantly. Who behaved strangely? Who cannot be trusted? Who changed recently? Who seems dishonest? Who might secretly dislike someone else? The prehistoric tribe relied on this information for survival, and unfortunately, the brain never moved on. Even now, humans monitor social dynamics compulsively. Tiny tone changes in messages, facial expressions lasting half a second too long, delayed responses, slight vocal tension. The human mind became a machine for interpreting invisible social danger. Language sharpened that machine continuously. And then something even stranger happened. Humans began speaking to people who were not there. At first, this sounds impossible, but it is actually ordinary now. Modern humans constantly hold imaginary conversations internally. They rehearse future arguments, imagine apologies, prepare explanations, recreate past discussions with alternative outcomes. The brain simulates social interaction continuously, which may have emerged only after language reached sufficient complexity. And once that ability appears, loneliness changes shape forever, because now a person can feel socially haunted even while physically alone. An ancient human sitting beside fading embers at night may have replayed conversations internally long after others slept. Perhaps not with full modern narration yet, but enough symbolic memory to reactivate emotional tension. Maybe this was the beginning of shame. True shame requires mental self-observation, the ability to imagine how others perceive you even when they are absent. Language enabled that, which means civilization may partially rest upon humans becoming chronically self-conscious. An unfortunate foundation in many ways. You can almost imagine earlier humans existing with a kind of emotional immediacy modern people rarely experience. Embarrassment passes quickly if it cannot be endlessly narrated internally. Fear dissipates faster if imagination cannot continuously rehearse future disaster. Language preserved emotional states beyond their natural biological duration. That is one reason humans ruminate. And rumination may be among the strangest side effects of language evolution. The brain revisits problems repeatedly because symbolic thought allows incomplete situations to remain psychologically open. Animals generally resolve tension through action, exhaustion, or withdrawal. Humans, instead, create recursive mental loops. A person can relive humiliation from 10 years ago while quietly eating soup. An astonishing species. And prehistoric humans likely encountered early versions of this phenomenon long before civilization existed. Perhaps the first fluent minds suffered uniquely because their brains outran the emotional systems evolution had prepared. A familiar human problem. Technology changes faster than biology. The human nervous system still carries ancient predator responses while living inside symbolic environments too abstract for instinct to navigate properly. No prehistoric ancestor evolved to calmly process global financial systems, social media judgment, digital identity, infinite information exposure. Yet here we are, still essentially campfire mammals, with overheated symbolic brains. And perhaps that is why humans remain so vulnerable to stories. Stories organize uncertainty. They compress chaos into sequence. Beginning, middle, ending. The ancient world contained overwhelming uncertainty. Storms, disease, animal attacks, failed migrations, sudden death during sleep. Child mortality so common that grief itself became routine. Language allowed humans to place suffering inside narrative structure. That made pain feel survivable. Even modern humans instinctively search for narrative after disaster. People ask, why did this happen? What does it mean? What lesson exists inside it? The brain dislikes randomness intensely, and language became the primary tool for manufacturing meaning. Sometimes accurate meaning, sometimes completely invented meaning. The distinction mattered less emotionally than modern people prefer admitting. A comforting explanation often stabilizes the nervous system more effectively than uncertainty. Ancient humans probably discovered this accidentally. A story about angry spirits may have reduced panic more effectively than admitting complete ignorance about illness or weather. And once emotionally stabilizing narratives appear, cultures preserve them fiercely, not because they are rational, because they are regulating. Humans are not purely truth-seeking creatures. They are nervous system management creatures, a difficult fact for civilization. And all the while, language kept growing. Slowly, relentlessly. More words, more abstraction, more memory storage, more social complexity, more emotional nuance. Until eventually humans became capable of discussing things so abstract they no longer physically existed anywhere at all. Justice, honor, destiny, sin, freedom. These are invisible structures held entirely inside shared language systems, which means civilization itself is partly hallucinated collectively into existence. Stable hallucination, perhaps, but still symbolic. And prehistoric humans began this process in tiny, trembling increments around uncertain fires, while predators moved beyond the darkness. There is something strangely intimate about imagining those first long conversations. Not dramatic speeches, not eloquent philosophy, probably awkward, fragmented attempts to transfer increasingly complicated internal experiences. Maybe someone trying desperately to explain a dream. Maybe someone describing a dead relative's face from memory. Maybe someone inventing the first metaphor accidentally because literal language failed emotionally. And perhaps somewhere during those long prehistoric nights, humans crossed an invisible threshold. Not when they first spoke, but when they first realized another human mind could contain worlds they themselves could not directly see. That realization changes everything. Because once humans understand that invisible thoughts exist inside others, paranoia, empathy, manipulation, intimacy, religion, politics, and love all deepen simultaneously. Language opened the skull psychologically, and nothing after that was ever simple again. At some point in prehistory, a human being pointed towards something in the world and gave it a stable sound, not just a warning cry, not just emotion, a name. And that small act may have altered human consciousness more profoundly than the invention of kings, cities, or machines ever would. Because once something receives a name, it becomes strangely permanent inside the mind. Before language fully matured, the world may have felt fluid in ways modern humans barely understand. Experiences came and went. Fear appeared and disappeared. Faces were remembered emotionally more than symbolically. The forest was not divided neatly into categories and labels. Then humans began carving reality into pieces using sound. This tree, that river, this animal, that person. And slowly, the world transformed from flowing experience into organized symbolic territory. Modern people rarely notice how aggressively language edits reality. The brain stops seeing a moving complex object with bark texture and leaf structures and simply says, tree, instantly compressed. Categorized, stored, human beings became creatures who no longer merely experienced the world. They named it, and naming something gives an unsettling illusion of control. Ancient humans probably discovered this emotionally before they understood it intellectually. A named thing feels less chaotic than an unnamed thing. Children still demonstrate this instinct naturally. A child frightened by thunder often calms slightly after receiving an explanation. Even a weak explanation helps. The nervous system prefers symbolic order over uncertainty. So early language did not merely improve communication, it reduced terror, at least temporarily. Of course, humans being humans, they immediately began using names to create entirely new forms of terror as well. An efficient species. Once people themselves received stable names, identity changed permanently. Before symbolic permanence, a human life may have faded socially much faster after death, but names preserve continuity. A named individual can remain psychologically present long after the body disappears. This changed grief in ways almost impossible to overstate. Somewhere in the distant prehistoric past, there may have been a mother repeating the name of a dead child quietly beside a fire long after everyone else slept, and suddenly, death no longer vanished cleanly into nature. Language allowed the dead to linger, a terrifying development for the human nervous system. Modern humans still carry invisible populations inside their minds constantly. Dead grandparents, old teachers, former lovers, childhood friends not seen for decades. People survive internally through remembered language patterns. Their phrases remain. Their warnings remain. Their humor remains. The body dies. The voice echoes. Ancient humans may have experienced the earliest versions of this phenomenon with overwhelming emotional force. Once language became rich enough to preserve identity symbolically, humans crossed into a new psychological world where absence itself became complicated. A dead person could now continue influencing the tribe socially. Stories about them survived. Lessons survived. Warnings survived. Sometimes fear survived too. And perhaps this is where ghosts truly began. Not necessarily supernatural ghosts at first. Psychological ones. The feeling that a person remained present through memory and language despite physical disappearance. The modern world still operates this way constantly. Entire civilizations obey the recorded words of dead people. Ancient rulers still influence politics. Long-dead philosophers still shape morality. Religious founders continue directing human behavior thousands of years after decomposition erased their bodies completely. Language defeated biological death partially, not physically, narratively. And the human mind may never have fully adjusted to this. Because our emotional systems evolved in a world where absence once meant disappearance. Language complicated that simplicity forever. Now grief could stretch endlessly. A person could replay a dead loved one's words for decades. Humans became haunted animals. And strangely enough, this haunting may have encouraged religion. Not because ancient humans were foolish, but because symbolic consciousness naturally produces certain emotional problems. Once humans developed strong internal narrative systems, they became capable of imagining invisible continuation. Dreams intensified this. Dreams must have been profoundly disturbing for early humans. Even modern people, fully educated and neurologically accustomed to symbolic thinking, still wake from dreams emotionally affected by events that never physically happened. The body responds sincerely to imaginary experiences. Ancient humans had far fewer conceptual boundaries separating dream from reality. Imagine dreaming vividly about a dead tribe member shortly after burial, seeing them speak, hearing their voice clearly, feeling their presence emotionally, then waking into cold darkness beside fading firelight. Without modern neuroscience, what conclusion would seem reasonable? The dead person appeared somewhere. Perhaps they still existed. Perhaps another world surrounded this one invisibly. Language allowed these experiences to become shareable, and once shared repeatedly, private dreams become collective mythology. This is how symbolic systems spread through groups, not through formal invention, but through emotional reinforcement. One person dreams something strange, another experiences similar fear. A story forms around repeated uncertainty. Eventually, the story stabilizes into belief. Belief stabilizes into ritual. Ritual stabilizes into culture. And culture begins regulating entire populations emotionally. Ancient religion may have functioned partly as nervous system management for language-aware creatures struggling with mortality and uncertainty. Modern humans still use symbolic systems similarly, though often disguised differently. National identity, financial belief systems, political narratives, social status structures. Humans remain dependent on shared abstractions to organize psychological reality. The prehistoric campfire simply evolved into larger stages, and all the while, language kept changing sleep itself. This is rarely discussed enough. Before rich symbolic consciousness, sleep may have been biologically simpler. Exhaustion arrives, the body rests. Fear remains immediate and sensory. But once language and imagination deepen, night becomes psychologically crowded. Now humans replay conversations while trying to sleep. They anticipate tomorrow. They revisit mistakes. They imagine disasters. The darkness becomes populated with thoughts. Ancient humans likely experienced the beginning of this transformation slowly and unevenly. Perhaps some individuals possessed stronger internal symbolic processing than others. Those individuals may have appeared unusually insightful or unusually troubled. There is a strange possibility that some early shamans, prophets, or visionaries were simply humans with especially intense symbolic cognition, emerging before broader populations fully adapted. A dangerous position to occupy socially, because people fear minds that seem connected to invisible realities, and language amplified this fear tremendously. A person capable of persuasive, symbolic storytelling could now influence group behavior through invisible threats and promises. They could describe unseen forces, future punishment, sacred obligations, protective spirits, moral consequences, extending beyond death. And importantly, these ideas changed behavior even when unprovable. This was revolutionary. Humans became controllable through imagination, an extraordinary efficiency improvement for large societies. You no longer needed physical force constantly. Narrative itself could regulate behavior. A person alone at night might obey invisible moral rules simply because language allowed internal monitoring to continue even without witnesses. In some ways, civilization outsourced tribal surveillance directly into the individual mind. People learned to watch themselves. And perhaps that is why modern humans remain so psychologically exhausted. The brain never fully stops evaluating itself socially, even alone, even in silence. There is always some observer active internally, some imagined audience, some invisible tribunal reviewing memory. Ancient humans may have experienced the earliest forms of this self-monitoring with increasing intensity as language evolved, which means the human mind gradually became both narrator and prison, a beautifully tragic development. And somewhere during this long prehistoric transition, humans also began understanding time differently. This mattered enormously. Animals experience time primarily through cycles and immediate biological needs. Humans eventually developed narrative time, past, future, sequence, historical continuity. Language stabilized memory. A story could now survive beyond the moment of experience. That sounds harmless until you realize it means suffering also survives more efficiently. A failed hunt becomes remembered humiliation. A betrayal becomes preserved socially. A mistake acquires narrative permanence. The tribe remembers. The individual remembers. And eventually, the individual remembers that the tribe remembers, which creates shame layered on top of shame. Humans became uniquely capable of socially preserved embarrassment, an astonishing burden to place on a nervous system originally designed mostly for locating food and avoiding predators. And yet, this same symbolic memory allowed incredible cooperation. A tribe no longer needed every member to learn danger personally. Knowledge accumulated. Stories warned younger generations. Information traveled across time. This may be one reason elders became so valuable in ancient societies. Older humans carried enormous survival data internally. Seasonal patterns, dangerous regions, illness signs, social histories, conflict memories. But there was also a problem. Human memory is deeply unreliable. Ancient tribes probably made life and death decisions based on distorted, remembered narratives constantly. A predator attack from 20 years earlier becomes exaggerated gradually. A migration route becomes mythologized. A coincidence becomes sacred tradition. And once language stabilizes those distortions socially, they become difficult to remove. Modern civilization still struggles with this endlessly. Humans preserve emotionally compelling stories far more effectively than accurate ones. Prehistoric people were not uniquely irrational. They were simply the first to suffer from symbolic contagion, and perhaps no symbolic contagion spread more powerfully than fear itself. Fear stories survive extremely well. The brain prioritizes threat information automatically. An ancient warning about dangerous caves or hostile tribes spreads rapidly because paying attention to possible danger offers survival advantage. Unfortunately, this also means humans became vulnerable to chronic exaggerated fear systems. A tribe repeatedly told terrifying stories around firelight eventually begins emotionally inhabiting those fears continuously. Sound familiar? Modern media functions similarly, only faster and brighter. Ancient humans had local myths. Modern humans have 24-hour anxiety distribution networks. Progress. Still, beneath all this complexity remained the simple human body. Cold, hungry, exhausted, breathing smoke beside flickering fire. Language did not erase physical vulnerability. It merely layered symbolic reality over it. An ancient human worrying about spirits still needed dry shelter. A tribe discussing mythology still suffered tooth infections, injuries, parasites, starvation winters. The body remained stubbornly animal beneath the growing architecture of thought. And perhaps that contradiction sits at the center of human existence even now. The mind became enormous. The body remained fragile. A human can contemplate infinity while simultaneously being emotionally destroyed by lack of sleep and low blood sugar. Ancient people probably found this contradiction deeply confusing long before philosophy existed formally. Dreams suggested transcendence. Language suggested invisible worlds. Memory suggested continuity beyond death. But then, a simple infected wound could still kill someone slowly beside the fire within days. The universe felt both magical and brutally physical simultaneously. And humans never really resolved that tension. Even modern people drift between symbolic abstraction and biological helplessness constantly. One moment contemplating identity and meaning. The next moment emotionally destabilized because a stranger sent a message with a period at the end instead of an exclamation mark. The prehistoric nervous system remains surprisingly active beneath civilization. And maybe that is why ancient humans still feel emotionally close to us, despite thousands of generations separating us. They feared darkness. They feared exclusion. They feared death. They loved stories. They replayed memories. They searched for meaning in uncertainty. And somewhere deep inside their slowly rewiring minds, they began hearing themselves think more clearly than ever before, which may have been both humanity's greatest gift and the beginning of a very long loneliness. Somewhere in the prehistoric world, long before cities and kingdoms and philosophy and written law, a human being probably laughed at exactly the wrong moment. Not because anything was funny in the modern sense, but because tension inside the tribe became unbearable, and that may have been one of the most important moments in human emotional evolution. Because laughter is a strange sound. Animals make warning sounds, threat sounds, mating sounds, pain sounds. But human laughter is different. It often appears in situations that are confusing, uncomfortable, socially dangerous, or emotionally overloaded. People laugh during fear, during embarrassment, during funerals, during arguments. Sometimes while apologizing, sometimes while lying, which suggests laughter evolved not merely from joy, but from social pressure. Ancient humans lived under extraordinary interpersonal tension. Small groups trapped together constantly. Little privacy, shared sleeping areas, shared food stress, shared danger, shared grief, shared boredom. During long winters and storms, the tribe knew everything about everyone, or at least believed it did. Modern humans sometimes fantasize about prehistoric life as emotionally simpler, but psychologically, it may have been exhausting in very intimate ways. Imagine never truly being alone. No locked rooms, no private apartments, no headphones, no anonymous internet searches at 3 a.m. Every emotion visible to nearby people, constantly. Language intensified this visibility. Once humans could describe behavior socially, every awkward moment became narratively dangerous. A strange facial expression could become gossip. A hesitation could become suspicion. A mistake could become identity. And under those conditions, humor may have emerged partly as emotional pressure release, a way to soften social friction before it became violence. Even now, humans use humor defensively, constantly. Someone says something too honest, and another person immediately makes a joke. Tension rises in a room, and somebody laughs awkwardly. Humor redirects emotional danger sideways. Prehistoric tribes probably depended on this more than they realized. Because once language evolved enough to create social complexity, humans needed mechanisms to survive psychological closeness. And closeness is difficult. That may be one of the oldest truths in human history. The more language allowed humans to understand one another internally, the more opportunities existed for misunderstanding, disappointment, jealousy, resentment, and emotional concealment. Animals hide physically. Humans learned to hide psychologically. An extraordinary complication. Before symbolic consciousness became highly developed, emotions may have remained more behaviorally transparent. Fear looked like fear. Anger looked like anger. Attraction looked like attraction. But language introduced internal editing. Now humans could say one thing while feeling another. The face smiles. The stomach tightens. The tribe hears reassurance. The mind calculates danger. And this ability changed human relationships permanently. Love itself became stranger after language. Before complex symbolic thought, attachment may have been emotionally immediate and instinctive. But once humans developed richer internal narration, relationships became layered with interpretation. Now people could wonder, do they truly love me? What do they mean by that tone? Why did they hesitate before answering? Are they lying? Are they losing interest? The human mind became capable of socially generated paranoia, a remarkable feature to install into a species already struggling with survival. Ancient humans likely experienced early forms of romantic uncertainty with devastating emotional intensity because social bonds carried enormous practical importance. Losing a mate was not merely emotional pain. It could threaten survival, stability, food access, child protection, and social positioning within the group. Language amplified all of this. Words could now comfort. Words could seduce. Words could deceive. And perhaps most dangerously, words could promise impossible futures. Humans became creatures capable of emotionally inhabiting imagined tomorrows together. Two people sitting near a fire could discuss a future that did not yet exist. Future children. Future migrations. Future safety. Future belonging. Language allowed intimacy to extend beyond the immediate moment, which sounds beautiful, and often was, but it also created entirely new forms of suffering. Because now betrayal could happen symbolically long before it happened physically. A broken promise hurts differently from simple abandonment. It damages the imagined future itself. Ancient humans may have discovered this painfully, and once symbolic promises emerged, trust became psychologically complicated forever. Modern people still suffer from this ancient rewiring constantly. Much emotional pain comes not from physical events themselves, but from violated expectations constructed internally through language. The human heart breaks, partly because the human brain tells stories about tomorrow, and the tribe became increasingly dependent on those stories, not only in romance, in everything. Hunters promised successful returns. Leaders promised protection. Shamans promised meaning. Parents promised safety. And often, despite good intentions, reality failed to cooperate. The prehistoric world remained brutally indifferent to narrative. Storms ignored optimism. Disease ignored belief. Winter ignored confidence entirely. Which meant ancient humans probably lived inside a continuous tension between symbolic hope and physical uncertainty, a familiar human condition. And during all this, another quiet transformation was unfolding inside the mind. Humans were becoming increasingly aware of how they appeared to others. This is not the same as simple social awareness. Many animals recognize status and dominance. But humans developed something more recursive. They became aware that others possessed internal perspectives capable of judging them continuously. And once this awareness deepened, authenticity became dangerous. People began editing themselves socially. Perhaps not consciously at first, but gradually. A tribe member suppresses visible fear to avoid appearing weak. Someone pretends confidence during food shortages. Another person hides grief because emotional instability threatens social trust. Language allowed humans to construct performed identities. Modern civilization runs almost entirely on this mechanism. Most people do not move through society expressing raw internal reality openly. They perform calibrated versions of themselves, adjusted constantly depending on audience, status dynamics, danger, and expected reaction. Ancient humans likely began this exhausting process in smaller tribal settings long before cities existed. And once performance enters social life, loneliness changes shape again. Because now a human can feel isolated even while surrounded by others. The tribe sees the performance, not always the person beneath it. That loneliness may be among humanity's oldest hidden wounds. There is a painful irony here. Language evolved partly to connect minds more deeply, yet it also allowed humans to conceal themselves more effectively than any other species. A wolf cannot fake moral virtue. A human can build an entire false identity through narrative, which means civilization depends heavily on cooperative hallucinations about one another's sincerity, a slightly alarming foundation when examined too closely. And still, the human nervous system kept adapting around these new symbolic environments. Children born into language-rich tribes inherited not merely vocabulary, but entire emotional structures. They learned shame cues, social rituals, acceptable narratives, proper emotional performances. Culture became inherited psychology, and much of it originated accidentally. That may be one of the strangest aspects of human civilization. Many behaviors that later became sacred traditions probably began as temporary improvisations solving local problems. A tribe develops a ritual because repeating certain behaviors reduces anxiety before dangerous hunts. Generations pass. The ritual becomes spiritually necessary. Another group invents strict food-sharing rules during famine periods. Eventually, those emergency survival systems become moral law. Human beings are remarkably skilled at forgetting the original purpose of their own behavior. Even modern institutions operate this way constantly. Temporary emergency measures become permanent structures. Symbolic systems outlive the conditions that created them. Ancient humans probably experienced this repeatedly, as language preserved traditions longer than practical memory alone ever could. And because language allows emotional contagion across generations, fears survived too. A frightening story told around one fire might shape behavior centuries later. Imagine the psychological weight of inherited fear in prehistoric life. A child grows up hearing warnings about forests, rivers, caves, hostile tribes, spirits, winter routes, forbidden places. Much of this information likely contained practical survival value, but over time, practical fear and symbolic fear blend together. Humans become uncertain where danger truly ends. Modern people still live this way. Financial fear, social fear, political fear. Fear inherited from previous generations, emotionally long after original conditions changed. Language allows anxiety to travel through time. An extraordinary ability, and perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in parenting. Ancient parents carried immense psychological burden. Human children remain helpless unusually long compared to many animals. They require years of teaching, protection, emotional regulation, and social integration. Language transformed parenting from mostly biological care into psychological shaping. Now parents transmit invisible worlds into children, values, stories, warnings, beliefs, identity itself. A child learns not merely how to survive physically, but how to interpret reality symbolically. And because ancient life remained dangerous, much parental communication probably revolved around fear management. Do not go there. Do not trust them. Do not travel alone. Do not speak carelessly. Do not anger invisible forces. The prehistoric child inherited thousands of years of accumulated tribal anxiety through language before even understanding why. Again, not entirely unlike modern life. And perhaps this is why humans remain such emotionally contradictory creatures. We inherit ancient survival instincts, while living inside symbolic realities our ancestors slowly constructed through fear, memory, and imagination. The result is a species capable of astonishing tenderness and astonishing psychological cruelty simultaneously. Language enabled both. A mother comforting a frightened child beside a fire. A leader manipulating an entire tribe through invented threats. A lover whispering promises into darkness. A rival quietly spreading suspicion. All made possible through invisible symbolic transfer between minds. And somewhere, during these endless prehistoric nights, humans also began discovering something even stranger. The pleasure of being understood. Not merely heard, understood. A rare sensation even now. There are moments in human life when another person accurately grasps an internal experience you believed impossible to explain. A grief, a fear, a memory, a loneliness. For a brief moment, the separation between minds softens. Ancient humans likely experienced early versions of this with extraordinary emotional force, because symbolic communication itself still felt relatively miraculous. A thought leaving one skull and entering another successfully. No wonder storytelling became sacred. No wonder humans gathered around fires night after night, listening to voices drift through darkness. Language was not merely information exchange, it was emotional bridge building against isolation. And perhaps that is why humans kept talking more and more until silence itself began feeling uncomfortable. Because silence reminds the symbolic mind of separation. Words temporarily erase it, at least enough for people to survive another night together beneath the enormous indifferent sky. And yet, even surrounded by voices, humans remained alone inside themselves in ways language could never fully solve, which may have been the first truly heartbreaking discovery of civilization. At some point, without ceremony, the human brain learned to leave the present, not physically, mentally, and this may have been one of the most dangerous abilities evolution ever produced. A deer hears movement in the grass and reacts immediately. If the danger passes, the body settles. The moment closes. The nervous system returns to baseline. Humans eventually lost that simplicity. Once language became rich enough to construct imagined futures, the mind no longer needed immediate danger in order to suffer. This changed existence permanently. An ancient human sitting beside a fire after a successful hunt could suddenly imagine the next hunt failing. Then imagine winter arriving early. Then imagine children starving. Then imagine the tribe blaming them. Then imagine abandonment. Nothing physically threatening needed to happen at all. The body still reacted. Heart rate changes. Muscles tighten. Sleep becomes shallow. The future invades the nervous system. And from that point onward, humanity may have become the first species capable of experiencing disaster before disaster actually arrived. An extraordinary evolutionary achievement, terrible for relaxation. There is something deeply strange about how modern people casually live with this condition every day. Most humans now spend enormous portions of life emotionally responding to events that do not exist yet. Bills not yet due, conversations not yet happened, illnesses not yet diagnosed, rejections not yet experienced. The ancient brain became trapped inside predictive simulation. And perhaps the earliest humans, who experienced strong future-oriented cognition, suffered profoundly from it. Imagine being among the first minds capable of vividly anticipating death. Not immediate death. Inevitable death. That realization must have arrived slowly and unevenly across generations. Earlier, humans certainly reacted to danger instinctively, but richer symbolic consciousness introduced a horrifying expansion. The ability to understand mortality abstractly and continuously. A person no longer fears only the predator nearby. Now they understand that someday, somewhere, regardless of preparation, they themselves will disappear. And then an even more disturbing realization follows. Everyone they love will disappear too. Language allowed this understanding to stabilize inside memory. Which means humans did not merely become intelligent, they became existential. A difficult burden for an animal body originally optimized mostly for surviving weather and locating food. Ancient humans probably encountered mortality awareness through repeated observation. Bodies aging, injuries worsening, illness taking tribe members unpredictably, infants dying, hunters failing to return, faces slowly disappearing from daily life. And once language evolved enough to organize these observations narratively, death transformed from isolated events into permanent psychological expectation. The mind began projecting itself toward future absence. Modern humans still struggle with this intensely. Entire civilizations construct elaborate symbolic systems to soften mortality awareness because the naked realization itself is psychologically destabilizing. Some pursue religion, some pursue legacy, some pursue wealth, some pursue children, some simply distract themselves continuously until the problem becomes unavoidable again at 3 a.m. Ancient humans likely experimented with all available emotional solutions long before philosophy formalized them. And perhaps this is where the earliest shamans emerged. Not necessarily as frauds, not necessarily as mystics, but possibly as humans whose symbolic cognition became unusually intense. Every tribe probably contained individuals more psychologically sensitive than others, people more affected by dreams, more vulnerable to emotional overwhelm, more imaginative, more introspective, more susceptible to altered states during fasting, isolation, illness, sleep deprivation, rhythmic chanting, or fear. The prehistoric world produced these conditions constantly. Long darkness, nutritional stress, extreme cold, physical exhaustion, loss, isolation during hunting, repetitive drumming, smoke-filled caves, firelight flickering against stone walls for hours. The human brain under these conditions behaves strangely, still does. And once language exists, strange internal experiences become interpretable through symbolic frameworks. A person hears a voice internally during grief. A dream feels prophetic. A coincidence appears meaningful. An altered mental state becomes spiritual revelation. Ancient humans may not have sharply separated psychology from cosmology, because symbolic consciousness itself was still new and mysterious. To them, thoughts probably felt external sometimes. And honestly, even modern humans occasionally experience this in subtle ways. Sudden intuitions, emotional certainty without evidence, internal voices of self-criticism, appearing automatically, dreams affecting waking mood for entire days. The mind remains partially opaque to itself. Ancient humans simply lived closer to that opacity. And because language allowed these experiences to be shared socially, tribes could collectively organize around them. A shaman describes visions. Others listen. The visions become stories. The stories become ritual. The ritual becomes reality, emotionally. Civilization repeatedly grows from these loops. What is fascinating is that many ancient rituals may have accidentally functioned as neurological regulation systems. Chanting synchronizes breathing. Repetition stabilizes attention. Group movement reduces isolation anxiety. Rhythmic sound affects emotional states deeply. Humans discovered psychological technology long before understanding neuroscience. They simply called it sacred. And perhaps, in some sense, it was. Because once language rewired the human brain toward recursive thought, people needed methods for surviving their own consciousness. Modern humans still do. Meditation, prayer, music, storytelling, therapy, alcohol, endless scrolling. Different tools, same underlying problem. The mind became too active. There is a quiet tragedy hidden inside human evolution here. The very abilities that allowed civilization to emerge also increased emotional suffering dramatically. Rich memory creates nostalgia. Future simulation creates anxiety. Self-awareness creates shame. Symbolic identity creates insecurity. Language made emotional pain more durable. Animals suffer physically. Humans suffer physically, psychologically, socially, symbolically, and imaginatively, all at once, an impressively inefficient arrangement. And prehistoric humans may have noticed this before having words sophisticated enough to explain it clearly. Imagine sitting awake beside dying embers after everyone else sleeps. The fire crackles softly. Wind moves through darkness outside the shelter. Someone nearby coughs in their sleep. The tribe is exhausted after migration. And yet your mind continues moving, remembering old fears, imagining future ones, replaying conversations, thinking about the dead, wondering what happens after death, wondering whether invisible forces watch from beyond firelight. The body wants rest. The mind refuses. This may have been among the earliest forms of insomnia, caused not by danger, but by consciousness itself. Modern humans know this state intimately. The strange exhaustion of a brain unable to stop generating thought despite physical fatigue. Ancient humans probably experienced it too, though perhaps with even greater intensity, because darkness offered fewer distractions. No electric light, no books, no devices. Only the body, the fire, the tribe, and the endless interior machinery beginning to awaken fully. And once that machinery existed, humans could no longer fully return to simple immediacy. That may be why nostalgia for simpler existence appears throughout history repeatedly. Agricultural societies romanticized hunter-gatherers. Industrial societies romanticized rural life. Modern people fantasize about cabins in forests while secretly bringing Wi-Fi routers. Humans repeatedly sense that something became psychologically overcomplicated somewhere along the way. perhaps because it did. And yet the same symbolic abilities causing suffering also created astonishing beauty. Poetry becomes possible only once language grows emotionally flexible enough to describe internal states indirectly. Music gains deeper emotional meaning when tied to memory and narrative. Love becomes richer through symbolic intimacy. Storytelling becomes capable of transmitting entire emotional worlds across generations. Ancient humans slowly unlocked all of this simultaneously. The rewiring was not purely tragic, just expensive. And maybe nowhere was the cost more visible than in madness. Once humans began interpreting reality symbolically, the boundary between insight and delusion became unstable. A person who perceives hidden patterns may become visionary, or paranoid, or both. The human brain evolved specifically to detect patterns, because pattern recognition improves survival. Identifying predator movement, weather changes, dangerous terrain, hostile behavior, all critically important. But once symbolic cognition intensifies, pattern detection can exceed reality itself. Humans begin seeing meaning everywhere, in stars, in dreams, in coincidences, in illness, in random events. Ancient humans probably oscillated constantly between genuine insight and symbolic overinterpretation. Modern humans still do. The difference is mostly technological decoration. And tribal groups likely treated psychologically unusual individuals with a mixture of fear and reverence. Someone hearing voices or entering trance states might become spiritually significant rather than medically categorized. The tribe interprets strange cognition through cultural narrative because no other framework exists yet. This produced an unusual social role. The person who travels mentally beyond ordinary reality and returns with symbolic guidance, the shaman, the prophet, the visionary, the haunted individual. Sometimes wise, sometimes unstable, sometimes both simultaneously. Human societies have always depended strangely on minds that operate near the edge of psychological overwhelm. Artists, mystics, religious founders, poets, revolutionaries. The boundary between creativity and mental destabilization has likely been blurry since language first expanded consciousness deeply enough to fracture certainty. And perhaps prehistoric humans sensed this intuitively. Because once the mind becomes capable of imagining worlds beyond immediate reality, it also becomes vulnerable to losing stable contact with consensus reality entirely. A frightening trade. Still, tribes needed meaning desperately. The prehistoric world remained mercilessly uncertain. Droughts arrived unpredictably. Disease spread invisibly. Accidents killed suddenly. Children died frequently enough that grief became woven into ordinary life. Language helped humans survive this uncertainty emotionally by creating narrative frameworks around suffering. The storm happened for a reason. The illness carried meaning. The ancestors remained nearby. The tribe belonged to a larger cosmic order. Whether objectively true mattered less psychologically than whether these narratives stabilized fear enough for people to continue functioning. Humans are meaning-hungry creatures, possibly because language itself generates the expectation that existence should make narrative sense, and when reality refuses, the mind struggles. Ancient humans likely felt this tension constantly. The world appeared emotionally charged, yet painfully indifferent at the same time. A parent prays desperately beside a sick child. The child dies anyway. Hunters perform rituals before migration. The storm destroys supplies regardless. Reality, often ignored, symbolic expectation. It still does. And yet, humans continued building meaning systems because the alternative, pure randomness, felt psychologically unbearable once consciousness became sufficiently self-aware. That may be the true legacy of language. Not merely communication, not civilization, but the creation of minds unable to stop searching for meaning, even inside silence, suffering, darkness, and death, which is beautiful and exhausting, and perhaps very lonely. At some point in the long prehistoric night, a human being discovered something astonishing. Not fire, not tools, not language itself, but the realization that words could alter the behavior of other minds without touching them physically. And once that understanding appeared, human society changed forever. Because language does not merely describe reality, it rearranges reality socially. A hunter says there are animals beyond the hills, and the tribe moves. A frightened elder warns of danger in the forest, and children avoid certain paths for years. A charismatic voice promises safety, and exhausted people follow. Nothing material changes immediately. Only symbols move through air, and yet entire groups reorganize behavior because of those symbols. This is an almost supernatural ability when viewed from the perspective of biology. One nervous system influencing another through invisible sound patterns. Ancient humans probably experienced the earliest forms of social persuasion with enormous emotional force because symbolic communication itself still carried an aura of mystery. Certain individuals naturally became more influential than others, not necessarily stronger, faster, or more physically capable, but more compelling narratively. And this may have been the true beginning of power. Not physical dominance, psychological coordination, a dangerous new form of survival advantage. Before sophisticated language, leadership likely depended heavily on immediate, visible competence. The strongest fighter, the best hunter, the most physically intimidating individual. But language changed hierarchy. Now a physically weaker person could influence stronger individuals through symbolic skill. A person capable of calming fear during crisis became valuable. A person capable of organizing group belief became dangerous. A person capable of inventing emotionally persuasive explanations became nearly unstoppable under certain conditions. And prehistoric tribes probably discovered this accidentally. A drought arrives. Food becomes scarce. Fear spreads. One voice speaks confidently about what must be done. The tribe follows because uncertainty itself is unbearable. Humans have always preferred confident stories over helpless confusion, even now, especially now. And once language allowed humans to share imagined realities collectively, something extraordinary emerged. People could cooperate around things that did not physically exist. This was revolutionary. A wolf pack coordinates through instinct and immediate signals. Humans learned to coordinate through fiction. Shared myths, shared rules, shared identities, shared invisible systems. These things exist nowhere physically, yet entire civilizations eventually organized around them completely. Money only functions because people collectively believe symbolic paper or numbers possess value. Nations exist because millions of strangers emotionally agree they exist. Religious systems survive because narratives persist socially across generations. Language allowed humans to construct enormous invisible structures inside collective imagination. And once those structures became stable enough, civilization itself became possible. But there is something quietly unsettling about this realization, because it means humans increasingly lived inside realities composed partly of stories, and stories can be manipulated. Ancient humans likely encountered this problem very early. Once symbolic authority emerges, certain individuals gain the ability to shape collective perception itself. They can define what events mean, which fears matter, which memories deserve preservation, which behaviors become moral. Narrative control becomes social control. Modern humans remain extraordinarily vulnerable to this. A story repeated often enough begins feeling emotionally true even without evidence. The human nervous system responds more strongly to compelling narrative than to statistical accuracy. Ancient tribes depended on emotionally memorable stories because memory itself functioned narratively. But this also made humans vulnerable to symbolic contagion. A terrifying rumor spreads rapidly because danger information always spreads rapidly. An inspiring myth spreads because hope is emotionally regulating. A false accusation spreads because social threat information captures attention automatically. The prehistoric world may have been psychologically crowded, with invisible narratives shaping behavior constantly. Again, not entirely unlike modern civilization. The scale changed. The mechanism did not. And perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in the birth of tribal identity. At first, humans likely identified primarily through direct familiarity, known faces, shared experiences, immediate relationships. But language allowed identity to expand symbolically. Now people could belong to groups larger than personal acquaintance. Our people, our ancestors, our land, our spirits. The human brain became capable of emotionally attaching to abstractions, which sounds noble until you realize it also enabled hostility toward other abstractions. Once humans developed symbolic group identity, outsiders became psychologically simplified. The tribe constructs stories about neighboring groups: dangerous, dishonest, unclean, cursed, inferior, threatening. Language amplified tribal boundaries enormously. A slightly different accent might trigger distrust. Different rituals become suspicious. Different stories become offensive. Humans evolved as intensely symbolic territorial creatures. And once these symbolic identities stabilized socially, people became willing to suffer and inflict suffering for ideas invisible to the physical world entirely. An extraordinary development. Ancient humans probably found this emotionally intoxicating. Shared identity reduces loneliness. It creates meaning, belonging, continuity. A frightened individual becomes part of something larger psychologically. Civilization still depends on this emotional mechanism constantly. People crave symbolic belonging with astonishing intensity. Religious groups, political movements, national identity, sports teams, online communities. The ancient tribal nervous system remains fully operational beneath modern clothing, and language keeps feeding it endlessly. There is a peculiar comfort in shared stories, even strange ones, especially strange ones, perhaps. A tribe gathered around firelight, hearing the same myths, repeatedly experiences emotional synchronization. People breathe together, react together, fear together, hope together. The boundary between individual minds softens. Humans become temporarily unified through narrative. This may explain why storytelling became sacred almost everywhere. Not merely because stories preserve information, but because they regulate collective emotion. A frightened tribe hearing familiar myths during hard winters feels less psychologically fragmented. The story says, "We understand this suffering. Others survived before us. The chaos has shape. The fear has meaning." Whether objectively accurate matters less emotionally than whether the nervous system stabilizes enough to continue functioning. Humans are remarkably dependent on shared emotional framing. Without it, uncertainty becomes corrosive, and prehistoric life contained uncertainty constantly. Storms destroying shelters overnight, animals disappearing from hunting grounds, children becoming sick without explanation, rivers changing course unexpectedly, death arriving suddenly from infections invisible to understanding. Language helped humans psychologically domesticate randomness, not eliminate it. Narrate it, an important distinction. And once humans discovered that narrative could regulate emotional reality, societies became increasingly organized around symbolic management. Who controls the stories? Who defines morality? Who interprets disaster? Who speaks for the unseen? These questions became civilization questions long before civilization formally existed. Ancient leaders may have understood this intuitively, without articulating it explicitly. A tribe unified emotionally survives crisis more effectively than a fragmented one. So rituals emerge. Shared phrases emerge. Repeated myths emerge. The group begins living partly inside a constructed mental world, a cooperative hallucination, stable enough to organize survival, fragile enough to collapse under pressure. And language keeps enlarging that invisible architecture generation after generation. Children inherit stories before understanding evidence. They inherit emotional reactions before logic. A child learns who we are, what we fear, what we worship, what we remember, what we never question. Culture enters the nervous system through repetition long before conscious reasoning develops. Ancient humans likely noticed this only dimly. Yet every tribe was already shaping minds symbolically from birth, which means civilization began not with buildings, but with shared imagination. There is something eerie about realizing how much of human existence depends entirely on collective agreement. Remove the stories, and many social structures dissolve instantly. Borders become lines imagined into emotional reality. Authority becomes performance sustained through belief. Status becomes symbolic theatre. Prehistoric humans slowly built these systems from almost nothing except sound, memory, and repetition. An astonishing achievement for creatures still sleeping nervously beside firelight. And perhaps the strangest part is that the human brain often prefers shared illusion over isolated truth. A lone individual rejecting tribal narrative risks exclusion. Exclusion once meant death, so evolution rewarded social conformity deeply. Modern humans still experience this constantly. People fear social rejection more intensely than factual error in many situations, because the nervous system evolved prioritizing group belonging above abstract truth. Ancient tribes depended on this cohesion, but it also made them vulnerable to manipulation. A persuasive voice can redirect collective fear. An invented enemy can unify scattered frustration. A sacred narrative can justify suffering. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern because the underlying psychological machinery remains ancient. Language did not merely allow humans to express thought, it allowed thought itself to become contagious. and contagious ideas behave strangely. Some survive because they are useful. Some survive because they are frightening. Some survive because they are emotionally addictive. Some survive simply because they are repeated constantly. The prehistoric world was likely filled with ideas mutating through tribes, much like living organisms. Stories changing slightly with each retelling, rituals adapting, beliefs competing socially. The human brain became ecosystem as much as organ, and eventually, somewhere along this long path, humans began constructing realities so abstract that individuals would willingly sacrifice their own lives for them. Honor, destiny, the tribe, the ancestors, the gods. No animal before humans appears to have organized itself through symbolic imagination at this scale, which raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps civilization is not humanity escaping animal behavior. Perhaps it is animal behavior amplified catastrophically through language. A predator kills for food or territory. Humans kill for stories, an uncomfortable distinction. And yet those same stories also created extraordinary compassion. Shared myths encouraged cooperation between strangers. Moral systems reduced violence within groups. Narratives about ancestors preserved wisdom across generations. Language allowed empathy to travel farther than direct personal experience. Humans became capable of caring about people they had never met. Another revolutionary development. Again, beautiful and dangerous simultaneously, because once emotional concern extends symbolically, so does emotional fear. Now distant disasters matter. Distant enemies matter. Distant reputations matter. The mind stretches itself across invisible social networks endlessly. The ancient nervous system was never fully designed for this scale of symbolic burden. Still isn't. Which may explain why modern humans often feel psychologically overwhelmed despite physical safety unprecedented in history. The brain continues treating social narrative as survival reality because for most of human evolution, it truly was. And beneath all these expanding symbolic systems remained the simple, ancient human body, breathing, shivering, aching, hungry, trying to survive another winter while carrying increasingly complicated invisible worlds inside the skull. Perhaps that is the strangest image of all. A fragile animal sitting beside a small fire under infinite darkness, quietly inventing civilization through stories. Eventually, somewhere across the long, unrecorded centuries, humanity crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Not a visible line. Not a historical event anyone witnessed consciously. No trumpet sounded. No sky opened. No ancient human announced. We are now psychologically different. And yet the difference arrived anyway. The mind stopped being merely a survival tool and became an environment. A place humans lived inside continuously. That may have been the final rewiring. Earlier humans certainly possessed awareness, memory, fear, attachment. But, over time, language deepened and folded inward until the human brain became capable of constructing entire internal worlds independent of immediate reality. And once that happened, silence itself changed. Modern people often misunderstand silence completely. They imagine silence means absence of sound. But the deeper silence, the one many humans quietly fear, is the absence of distraction. Because once external noise fades, the internal world becomes audible again. Ancient humans likely encountered this intensely during long nights, solitary hunts, migrations across empty landscapes, winter isolation, illness, grief. There were enormous stretches of prehistoric life where nothing happened externally for hours except weather and breathing. And during those stretches, the symbolic mind kept moving, remembering, imagining, rehearsing, regretting, wondering. At some point, humans became unable to fully return to immediate existence because language permanently expanded the psychological distance between experience and consciousness. The mind began watching itself live. That sounds poetic at first, until you experience it too long. There is something exhausting about self-awareness when it becomes continuous. Modern humans know this intimately. A person can feel sadness and simultaneously analyze the sadness, feel anger and critique the anger, experience joy while already anticipating its disappearance. The mind splits itself recursively. Ancient humans may have experienced the earliest forms of this fracture gradually, generation by generation, as symbolic cognition intensified. And perhaps not everyone adapted equally well. There may have been humans whose minds wandered too deeply inward compared to the needs of prehistoric survival. People prone to rumination, melancholy, obsession, withdrawal, symbolic overload. Today, such individuals might become philosophers, writers, artists, mystics, or people quietly staring out windows, wondering why existence feels vaguely unreal. Prehistoric tribes may simply have viewed them as strange, or sacred, or unstable. Sometimes, all three simultaneously. Because once the human brain became capable of abstract reflection, another unsettling realization emerged slowly. Humans were no longer entirely part of nature in the way other animals seem to be. A wolf hunts, sleeps, breeds, dies. The wolf does not appear to agonize over meaning. Humans began doing exactly that. The prehistoric world must have felt increasingly uncanny as symbolic consciousness deepened. Ancient humans still depended completely on natural systems, weather, migration, seasons, rivers, animal populations. Yet, internally, they were beginning to inhabit conceptual realities detached from the physical environment around them. A person could sit beside a river physically while mentally replaying a conversation from 3 winters earlier. The body remains in nature. The mind drifts elsewhere entirely. That separation may have produced the earliest forms of existential loneliness. Not loneliness from lack of people, loneliness from awareness itself. The strange realization that no other creature around you appears burdened by this kind of consciousness. Even today, humans sometimes envy animals quietly. Cats, sleeping peacefully in sunlight. Birds, existing moment to moment. Deer, moving through forests without visible philosophical crisis. Meanwhile, humans develop stress-related stomach problems because someone used a slightly formal tone in an email. The rewiring came with costs. And perhaps ancient humans sensed this before having sophisticated language for it. They may have felt increasingly divided between bodily existence and symbolic existence, without understanding the distinction clearly. Dreams intensified this division further. Dreams remained among the most mysterious experiences available to prehistoric humans. Every night, the mind detached partially from ordinary reality and entered emotionally convincing worlds generated internally. Dead people appeared. Impossible events occurred. Fear manifested physically. Memory merged with imagination. Then morning arrived. The tribe woke. And somehow, ordinary reality resumed. But the emotional residue remained. Modern neuroscience explains certain mechanisms behind dreaming. Yet dreams still retain an eerie quality because they reveal something unsettling. The human brain can manufacture convincing realities internally without external input. Ancient humans lived much closer to that realization. And perhaps, gradually, they began noticing that waking life itself also depended heavily on shared symbolic construction. Money, laws, morality, status, gods, tribal identity, reputation, all maintained collectively through language and belief. The line between real and imagined became psychologically complicated. Civilization itself increasingly resembled organized dreaming, stable dreaming, dangerous dreaming, emotionally binding dreaming. The human species became trapped inside symbolic systems so immersive that people willingly sacrificed physical survival for them. Individuals starved for honor, fought for ideology, died for invisible borders, killed for sacred narratives. Ancient humans began this process slowly, around fires, through myth and ritual. Modern civilization merely industrialized it. And somewhere along this long trajectory, humans also discovered another painful truth. Language could not fully solve loneliness. This may have been among civilization's saddest revelations. For thousands of years, humans expanded communication, constantly believing deeper understanding might eliminate isolation. More stories, more rituals, more emotional vocabulary, more poetry, more philosophy. Yet even the most intimate conversation still leaves a small, unbridgeable distance between minds. A person can describe grief endlessly and still feel misunderstood, can confess love sincerely and still fear abandonment, can speak constantly while secretly remaining emotionally unreachable. Ancient humans likely experienced this too. A mother unable to fully explain fear for her child. A grieving hunter unable to express the exact shape of loss. A lonely tribe member surrounded by familiar voices yet feeling strangely invisible internally. Language connected humans enormously, but not completely, never completely. And perhaps that incompleteness explains why humans never stop talking. Conversation itself may partly be an endless attempt to close a gap. Consciousness cannot entirely close. People speak into the darkness, hoping another mind truly receives the experience intact. Sometimes it almost happens, almost, enough to keep trying. And during all these centuries of expanding symbolic life, humans also began drifting psychologically farther from the rhythms that originally shaped the nervous system. The prehistoric body evolved for movement, sunlight, immediate danger, direct social contact, physical exhaustion, environmental immersion, but symbolic civilization gradually altered attention itself. Humans began spending more time inside abstraction than sensation, planning instead of noticing, remembering instead of observing, imagining instead of experiencing. This shift accelerated dramatically after agriculture, cities, writing, organized religion, economics, bureaucracy. But the earliest stages began much earlier, when language first taught humans to live partly inside memory and anticipation instead of immediate reality. And the nervous system may never have fully reconciled this transition. Even modern humans frequently experience moments where reality suddenly feels strangely distant. Watching sunlight through leaves, sitting quietly beside water, hearing wind at night. For brief moments, the symbolic machinery softens, and older sensory awareness returns. People often describe these moments as peaceful without understanding why. Perhaps because they temporarily reduce cognitive fragmentation. Ancient humans likely lived closer to those sensory states, while simultaneously moving towards symbolic overload generation by generation. A species caught between animal immediacy and abstract consciousness, not fully either one anymore. And perhaps that is why humans remain permanently restless. The body still remembers nature. The mind no longer fits entirely inside it. There is a haunting image hidden somewhere inside prehistory. A human sitting awake after the tribe sleeps, staring into low firelight, listening to distant wind, feeling thought continue endlessly, while the world itself remains silent. That moment may have repeated millions of times across human history, and eventually, those minds built everything: religion, empires, science, poetry, war, music, law, philosophy, art, loneliness, hope, despair, all emerging from nervous systems that accidentally became too aware of themselves. The truly strange part is that humans often treat consciousness as unquestionably beneficial. Intelligence became associated with superiority automatically. But evolution does not produce perfection. It produces survival compromises, and language may have been exactly that, a magnificent compromise. Humans gained planning, cooperation, memory transfer, symbolic culture, emotional depth, and civilization itself. In exchange, they received anxiety, shame, existential fear, psychological fragmentation, chronic overthinking, and the inability to fully escape awareness of mortality, a very human transaction. And despite all this, despite the burden, humans continued speaking, continued telling stories, continued reaching toward one another across darkness through fragile sound. That may be the most moving part of all, because even after language introduced suffering humans had never previously known, it also allowed tenderness impossible before. A parent calming a frightened child with words, a grieving person comforted beside a fire, a lonely mind discovering another mind with similar fears, a story surviving centuries to reach strangers not yet born. Language wounded humanity deeply and healed it constantly too. The same symbolic machinery causing despair also created meaning, which leaves humans in a strange position even now, unable to return to silence, unable to stop imagining, unable to fully escape loneliness, yet still endlessly trying to connect, still speaking into darkness, still building invisible bridges between isolated minds. And perhaps that is what civilization truly is, beneath all the noise and history and architecture and technology. Not merely progress, not merely survival, but billions of frightened conscious creatures trying over and over to feel less alone inside their own thoughts, while the fire burns low beside them and the night stretches quietly beyond the edge of language.